What's up, guys? Welcome back for hopefully my final video on Volume 1 of Mushoku Tensei Jobless Reincarnation. It has been a long and fun journey going through this entire series. I will say that there is a lot of stuff at the end of this volume, so hopefully I can fit it all in one part. But with that said, let's start off with Chapter 10 and jump right into it. Starting things off, there is a lot of emphasis starting in Chapter 10 about Paul himself. This is from Rudy's perspective, and it really does feel like at this point, it's almost as if Rudy's trying to talk him back up. We've obviously gone through a lot of terrible stuff that Paul's done. They keep bashing him, but at this point, it really does feel like Rudy's trying to bring him up a bit. So it's talking about how great Paul actually is. The fact that he's advanced in all the schools of sword is really impressive. He says that a normal talented person would take 10 years just to master one of these things, and we're talking about Paul being within his 20s. Even at age 7, Rudy's only a beginner in these classes. But not only that, but it also talks about how at some point Paul took him out to hunt monsters. He's seen Paul himself alone take on at the same time 3 assault dogs and a Terminator boar, which is a very weird name. It's supposed to be a bipedal 4-arm monstrosity. So he's seen him take on these things with very little effort, chopping off their heads. He was very skilled. Not only that, but he does acknowledge the fact that, yes, despite the fact that he won't keep with one woman, women flock around him. And yes, technically, like I spoke about before, this is something that instilled upon Rudy his desire not to get a harem, even though they'd probably be willing for it. He's taught him a lot of really important things. And additionally, having this strong person within the household has sort of swayed him away from doing bad things, bad choices that he probably would have done. He said that I would probably grow up to be a punk. I'd go out with all my skills and take on monsters and die, or take on the wrong people and die. Again, despite the fact of his flaws, he acknowledges the importance of Paul being in his life. Even though on a regular basis he sees him as inadequate to raising him because he does know that he was once a middle-aged man. And this is when we have a conversation between Paul and Rudy, and they start talking about his prospects for going to school. And yes, similar to the anime, Paul's trying to talk him out of it. Like, you have nothing but daughters of noble people that cover up their flaws, and you'll probably be bullied and all this kind of stuff. But it does have Rudy kind of acknowledge that I don't really think I need to. I have this knowledge of my previous life. And even though he kind of claims that Roxy taught him all this stuff, all this arithmetic and stuff that he was using, he said at some point he brought up that he can do this stuff because he didn't want them to fight over how they wouldn't have money. He knew they wouldn't have the money to send him to a school, and so he's like, well, just to kind of ease their mind, I'll claim that Roxy taught me everything. And following this, we get a huge, insane deep dive into essentially how labyrinths work in this world, which is super curious. I think the moment I seen this in the novel and I'm like, whoa, this is like super deep, I started super geeking out. I was so into this because not only does it kind of explain how labyrinths and dungeons work in this particular world, it explains them as a way that makes them believable and a breathing being within this world. Even Rudy says the same thing. He essentially explains how labyrinths are essentially caverns that are manipulated by magical energy. There's a magical crystal deep within it that is kind of protected by a sort of boss monster. And monsters are drawn to this cavern or this labyrinth by this power. They want to consume it. So you do have some cases where some labyrinths never actually live very long. Some monsters that are strong enough will get down in there, they will consume the crystal within it, and it'll kill it. And you have cases where the cavern itself just collapses on the crystal and breaks it. But the ones that remain, and this is the thing where it gets really fascinating, they're basically fueled by that which desires it. So monsters that come down there, if they die from traps or getting lost or starving, that energy from them will then feed the crystal and make it more stronger, and thus it will kind of expand itself. And even adventurers, when adventurers come down there, if they die in their travels into this cavern or they die to the boss, their energy will fuel the crystal and make it stronger and bigger. And he talks about the fact that adventurers obviously wanted to go down this cavern and get this middle crystal, and then they would carve magic upon it. But some point, things changed, as adventurers started seeking not the crystal within the middle, but actually the items within it. Over time, as monsters and adventurers traveled within this labyrinth and they would die, the equipment that they've dropped, essentially, over time, having this magical energy within it, they would become imbued by that magic. And he says that yes, most of the equipment ends up being just garbage. There's some cases where some of these magical items will be able to actually perform saint-level magic, which is insane. And yes, these things are sold for a lot of money. So a lot of adventurers not only just care about the core, they care about the journey to get these magical items and sell them for riches. So yeah, like I said, super cool. Like, it basically explains the existence of them. While it doesn't get into the explanation of where the core comes from in these caverns and where the boss that protects it just poofs out of nowhere, but at least it shows how this is a living, breathing thing, that over time it can grow and get bigger and bigger. It explains why there's massive size labyrinths. He even mentions one that is claimed to be the oldest and deepest pit of the dragon god. And this is at the foot of the Holy Mount Dragon Cry in the Red Worm mountain range. They estimate it being 10,000 years old and have 2,500 floors. Sword Art Online, eat your heart out. I can imagine, like, we could have an entire novel series just on going down 2,500 floors. If it's actually in the novel, don't tell me. I don't want to know. Well, again, that, yes, don't tell me. But at the same time, there's a little side of me that remembers a certain scene at the end of the first season that sort of implies that it might be this place. Additionally, there was one brief scene, I think it was the first time we seen Orsted. He was on this ridge, and this worm came down and cried at him before it left him. I almost thought that might be where Orsted was at. I think Orsted was at the Pit of the Dragon King, because it specifies that it's connected to a hole at the pinnacle of the Mount Dragon Cry. And while many will believe that this big, huge crater opening in the top of it was created by a volcano, this is the labyrinth opening up itself to draw in the red dragons to consume them. Because again, anything that comes in that dies or whatever is consumed by the crystal. And so you expect dragons who are, I would assume in this story too, dragons, I believe they talked about them a little bit in the later part of the second part. Dragons technically are very powerful. So you'd assume that these crystals would get a lot of energy from this. And it would also explain why this labyrinth is so huge. It's really cool. But anyways, like I said, I think that might have been where Orsted was at in that one shot that we seen at the end of, I believe, the first part. But super cool. Like I said, the labyrinth stuff was super cool to get into. I really do love how they managed, how much work this writer put into his labyrinths. It also explained that there was these ones that are challenging based on the fact that they're so far away from places to resupply. There's Hell on the Divine Continent, Devil's Cave, which is in the middle of the Ringus Sea. So they're so far away from the resupply that you have to travel so far that you can't really get much into it because you don't have the supplies to keep yourself alive. From this point, they did talk about specifically the three swordsmen in the labyrinth, which was one of the books that was always read to him by Paul. At this point, Paul confirms, no, this is a real story. This is where we got the Sword Kings, basically. All the sword arts that we have now was based on their travel, these three swordsmen. It's the adventures of the Sword God, the Water God, and the North God. And of course, Rudy from this immediately goes, okay, well, if these divine class swordsmen have issues in the labyrinth, I don't think I'm going to survive. But again, Paul technically believes that Rudy is skilled enough to actually get a party and go do labyrinths, because this is an option for Rudy to do besides go to school. Like, that's the option you give him. Like, you don't have to go to school. You could just be an adventurer. You're powerful enough. Following this, we have a little bit of a conversation between Sylphie and Rudy. At this point, Rudy's really kind of suffering because he feels like his growth is stunted. He hasn't seen any improvement in himself probably since he was with Roxy. And he's starting to wonder that maybe his ability to advance so quickly was probably due to his understanding of science and utilizing that in incantationless spells. But other than that, other than his knowledge of science that was giving him a head start, he's not very special. He even claims that Sylphie has learned things so fast, she's probably more apt of being a very skilled person versus him who's just utilizing his own knowledge. He's realizing at this point that he's at a stopping point. He's not growing. And so it does kind of hint him, I might want to go to one of these universities. That's university that Roxy even notes in the letter that she sends him. The Renoa University of Magic, which I like the fact that at the very end, I think he said it in the anime too, she notes at some point that this guy's just like somebody I know that would steal my underwear, and he's like, sorry for stealing your poncho at the very end of it. But this moves into the big controversy within this entire segment of chapters, which is the point in which Paul, we have Rudy where he's wanting to go to this university with Sylphie. Paul's realizing that he's got to put a stop to something. Paul at this point is realizing he's going to have to be the bad guy. He sees how reliant Sylphie is on Rudy, and even notes that Laws, Sylphie's father, would be perfectly fine with the two of them getting together. He's like, yeah, I'm perfectly fine with them getting engaged. But instead, Paul realizes how reliant Sylphie is on Rudy, and he wants to put a stop of it. He's like, my son, yes, if they get together and they're together, that's fine. But if Rudy ever steps away from Sylphie, if Rudy gets older and realizes at some point, no, I want to go with this person instead, that would be devastating to Sylphie. And so he kind of wants to create this divide. It's also twofold. There's an additional aspect of Paul realizing that Rudy's stuck. Rudy is not growing. And he wants to put him in a situation similar to his own where he's challenged. He wants to put him into a new environment just like he did when he was young. He wants to repeat what he went through. The fact that when he was very young, he left his home, went out adventuring, and gained skills through that whole process. And he wants Rudy to have that similar effect. Push him out, get him out there to get adventures that he'll never experience in this one little village. So it's very fascinating. I just don't really think I got that sense from the anime. I know that he had mentioned that Sylphie had a reliance on Rudy. I know that he wanted him to have these adventures and everything, but I don't know why. It just feels like with this whole chapter, I felt like I understood Paul so much more. And at the same time, I felt bad for him because at some point he's realizing I'm doing all this. I beat him up. He says that he almost failed. Like he even admits that was close. Like it took me 3 steps to take down Rudy. And that's dangerous when you're dealing with a mage. Rudy shocked him. He did not think he was going to get it. He says that if a couple seconds earlier I would have fell inside of his little snare and that would be it. But as he's putting Rudy, tying him up, stick him in the carriage, he's depressed about it. He doesn't like it. He even notes one of these days he's going to come back and get the crap out of me. So I need to start training more because he realizes that Rudy's going to grow so much more by doing this. But what was crazy about this whole scene, of course in the anime, like Ghislaine shows up, everybody greets her, and then Paul basically just goes on the attack. So Rudy met her, and then he gets attacked. But we never see Sylphie. That was the crazy thing. In the novel, as Paul is taking the tied up Rudy, who's unconscious, and taking him to the caravan, Sylphie sees him. He says, I hate the fact that Laws is bringing over Sylphie right now. He knows they're coming. He wants to rush to get them out of there. And sure enough, as he's walking up to this carriage, Sylphie sees him and immediately starts casting spells, offensive spells on Paul. He's able to, deflect it. But 1, there was no incantation, and 2, it was very dangerous. Like he says that would have killed a normal person. And I'm like, holy crap, confirmed Sylphie Yandere? Like, wait, I never knew. Like, this is crazy. Now, I know later on in the anime, they talk about how the moment that Rudy left, Sylphie went through like this crazy phase and was fighting back the bullies and stuff. And then she kind of settled down, but not I almost killed Rudy's dad kind of lashing out. That was crazy. I had a huge laugh when I read that. I'm like, what? I had to read it again. Also, after he deflected the spell from Sylphie, you had this moment where Laws is trying to reprimand her, like, you shouldn't have done that. And Paul's thinking to himself, yes, this is your chance, Laws. Get back in there to the position where you should be. Again, her reliance has been solely on Rudy. You need to come back in as a parental figure, no longer having Rudy be that insert. It's just really crazy to think about how much thought was put into just how much damage Rudy was doing on Sylphie and her reliance on him. It also notes the fact that when he's putting Rudy inside the carriage, apparently Lilia and Zenith, who was supposed to stay inside to watch, they come out the door and they were giving off a bunch of these theatrics about how, oh, my poor son is having to leave and everything, and Lily's like, oh, madam, it's okay. I'm like, where the heck did that come from? And even Paul goes, look, I'm gonna have to start training more during the day, and they just don't even care anymore. He's like, he's so been outcast by the family. And of course, later on, Rudy wakes up inside his carriage, meets Ghislaine. They kind of explain the whole situation where he's going to go train Edis at the Grey Rat Estate and get stronger and all that kind of stuff. And if you loathe me so much, come back and get me kind of thing. So pretty much his life going forward explained to him. This will allow him to get stronger. He's going to train under Ghislaine, who's much stronger than Paul is, except for in bed. And additionally, he's going to earn the money that he wants to go to this school with Sylphie. So it's kind of a win-win situation, even though he's going to be away from his home for many, many years. But that's when we get into the extra chapter. I've been so excited to talk about this. I think of anything in the first volume, if you're an anime-only fan, go read the extra chapter. Now, a lot of people explain this chapter as being pretty much the relocated final scene in season 1. At the very end of the anime adaptation, There's a brief scene where Zenith is talking about Rudy and says that she loves him, and then it cuts away. And this, a lot of people describe, was that scene. Now, granted, when I seen the back of the book and those last few lines at the end of that chapter, I said, yeah, that's that scene. But it's not. That's the crazy thing. It's not. There's so much more in here. In the anime, it's really just her reflecting on Rudy and their life and how much she loves Rudy. And it's just this perspective of her sitting at this table and then I'm eventually coming in and her saying something to Rudy. But in this extra chapter, it's really getting into so much more stuff. And it's really insightful to Zenith herself. What one thing have I not stated in my entire coverage of the first volume? Zenith's perspective. We've never had Zenith's perspective throughout the entire novel. We've had Lilia, we had Paul, never Zenith. She is the only one that we've never heard what she's thinking. And I would argue we never hear it in the anime either. We never know what she's thinking. Yes, we see her frustration. Yes, we see her outer appearance, her struggles that she faces, especially with the whole situation with Lilia and Paul. But this is where we actually get into her. It opens up kind of explaining where Zenith came from. She was born in the holy country of Milis, which I believe we've kind of mentioned that in the anime as well. She's a second daughter of a count. She was a perfect girl. She did everything by the book. She even, did all of the church's teachings. But unfortunately, at the age of 15, seems to be a common thing in this world, she had a falling out with her family. They dictated everything in her life, and this is like the breaking point for her. It noted that she was intermediate in healing magic and that she quickly got into an adventure group, and that adventure group kind of took advantage of her, kind of taking advantage of the fact that she didn't really know much what she was doing, probably paying her extremely poorly and treating her poorly, and she doesn't even know what would happen if she stayed with them long enough. But at some point, another man came across, which was Paul. Yes, Paul pretty much destroyed her party and brought her into their party. And she knew that he was a bad man. He was very coarse, but he always protected her, and though he would, grope her and whatnot. And at some point, obviously realizing that Paul liked her and was advancing on her, she finally says, look, I will allow it. I will go with you as long as you keep yourself only to me. That I will be the only woman. And he's like, yeah, sure. And she's like, I knew that he would lie, but he went along with it. And unfortunately for her, that was the first and only time, and it was enough to get her pregnant. And so it was a shock to her that he actually accepted to marry her the moment he found out that she was pregnant. This is a guy that seemed coarse and he seemed like he always lied, but he's actually going to take responsibility for it. So now that we have like the story leading up till now kind of covered, that gets into her perspective of Rudy. Setting up this scene, we essentially have Lilia's out to the market. We have Aisha and Nor inside this crib. You have Zenith sitting there watching Rudy make all these goofy faces to Aisha and Norn. And it's just shocking to her. She's like this boy who just never really shows emotion. He never really shows expression. She says she even barely ever sees him smile ever before. Suddenly, her child is animated. He's making all these goofy faces and he's smiling at their reaction. And this is something that greatly pleases her. She finally sees an emotion in her own child. She was always excited for Rudy, excited for his talent, excited that he was going to look into magic. But she was always afraid that he was secretly looking down upon them because of how skilled he was. She even wondered if he even loved his family at all, knowing that he never really even got attached to her. But there was a turning point in this. It was a point in which Lilia became pregnant and they had that family meeting. The moment that Rudy spoke up and said all this, which she knew was a lie, that Paul was forcing her to this relationship, she noted that Rudy looked as if he was afraid. She's seen that he was afraid of this family breaking apart. Again, she knew it was a lie, but she fixed the situation because of him. She chose to keep it together, even though she had thoughts of just walking out the door too. And this gets into after the birth itself, talking about how Rudy was so helpful, despite the fact that she was exhausted, despite the fact that Paul was flustered and didn't know what he was doing. He was always there. He was always taking care of them. And yes, you kind of notice the fact that it's almost as if he had a child before, like he knows what he's doing. Maybe he picked it up from Lilia. Doesn't know. But here's a questionable, but at the same time, very cute scene that kind of follows this kind of mindset. And that's where Norn starts crying. Rudy kind of inspects him like he always does, check the diaper and all that kind of stuff, and then realizes, Mom, she's hungry. And she goes to bring him up, and of course, Rudy's sitting there staring. And she's like, yeah, he always kind of does that stuff. It's kind of weird. He's kind of a perv in that regard. But then she teases him. And quickly Rudy looks away and blushes. Like he always liked to watch that kind of thing, and he gets really flustered by it. Again, It's a different mindset. It's that realization that he was embarrassed by it that sort of changed it from him looking at some woman's chest to him realizing he's looking at his mother's chest. But either way, Rudy has a desire to protect his sisters. And that's the thing that she's taking note of. As at some point, Aisha starts crying, he realizes that Aisha's hungry too. And he struggles because he wants to recommend to his mother, Aisha's hungry too, but Lilia's gone. It's going to be a while before she gets back. He's struggling with telling his mother to basically feed the child of somebody who's cheated on her husband. And despite that, despite the fact that she almost had a hesitation, she still does it. She has resentment for the whole situation. But in the end, it doesn't matter. And that's what she's realizing. Her son has kept her straight. Her son has kept her from walking away. And it was all in the desire to keep this thing together, to keep him comfortable. Like I said before, this chapter is really kind of hitting on that growth of Rudy through the eyes of Zenith herself, realizing that going from this point in which she felt isolated from Rudy, that Rudy was different, that Rudy looked down upon them, and eventually realizing all these things that he's done for them. Again, getting into the whole thing where when they were having birth and he was constantly there healing her and breathing them hot water and everything they needed for the pregnancy. Again, him taking special care of these two new sisters that he just absolutely seems like he's, yes, very knowledgeable, but very protective of and wants to do good for them. It's all these things that are slowly pulling Rudy from his previous life, a shut-in, a man-child, an isolated man. Now he's actually a part of this family. He's what kept everything together. He's what's keeping everybody sane right now. He is Zenith's son. And unfortunately, that's something I never seen in the anime. And it's something that I think is so clearly spelled in that last chapter. She thanks Rudy for being born, and the opposite, Rudy thanks her for having him. It kind of shows you that despite the fact that everything's so messed up, that it's not a normal situation. In the end, Paul, Zenith, Rudy, yes, even Lilia, they're family. It's a very weird family, but at the same time, they're still family. But that's it. That is volume 1 of Mushoku Tensei, Jobless Reincarnation. I'm done. It's time to move on to volume 2. Unfortunately, I don't have the physical volume 2, so I'm going to be probably reading it digitally, but it is what it is. I have definitely had a lot of fun. I hope you guys enjoy this entire video series for volume 1. Again, technically not my biggest hitting videos, but at the same time, it's a passion project. I'm enjoying it, and it seems like a lot of people are really enjoying it, so I love doing it. If you have not already, make sure to hit that subscribe button, as I will be going into volume 2 eventually. It might take me a little time to get around to that one, but definitely look forward to that. Additionally, I would appreciate it if you consider supporting us on Patreon or through our tips link in the description below. We definitely appreciate everybody that supports us, and y'all take care.